New videos every day.
Hi, I'm RADHlA. I'm a Certified Clinical Nutritionist, and I'm here to talk to you about, this is the second part of my conversation with you about carbohydrates. Now remember, in the beginning, we were talking about the various different kinds of carbohydrates. Remember that string of pearls or that string of saccharides. As those are broken down, they're broken down into monosaccharides that then are then become blood sugar or glucose, and then that glucose becomes ATP. Remember that? That blast of energy that makes our body actually function. Okay, so remember I told you that the body has a very, very strict regulatory system. It's controlled by what we call our endocrine system, and our endocrine system is our hormonal system. And hormones are basically chemical messengers. They basically tell the body to turn on or shut off different mechanisms, right? So we have our organs that may play certain functions, but imagine an organ as being the light fixture, right? So your liver is the light fixture, or, your kidneys are a light fixture, or your heart is a light fixture. But, and those organs may be absolutely just fine, but if the switch that turns them on or off isn't working, it really doesn't matter how good those organs are. So the endocrine system, or the hormonal system, in my opinion, is one of the most vital and important regulatory systems we have. Digestion and endocrine system are really, really vital in health, in longevity, in balance, metabolic balance. So in our endocrine system, we have several glands in there that regulate blood sugar. Pituitary, which is up in the brain. We used to call the pituitary the master gland. We're now seeing that perhaps the hypothalamus may be the master gland. But the pituitary secretes hormones that turn on or give chemical signatures or signals to other glands to give other releases of hormones. So next would be thyroid. Thyroid basically is regulated by the pituitary. The pituitary tells the thyroid basically what to do. And you might have heard, and your doctor may have told you about thyroid stimulating hormone. When you go and get a blood test for thyroid, they'll generally do a TSH. And a TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So basically, it comes from the pituitary. I consider the pituitary hypothalamus up in the brain, I call them air traffic control. So air traffic control is constantly monitoring what's going on in your body, what your energy levels are, etc. And then it's talking to the rest of your system and telling it to turn on or shut off different mechanisms to either make energy, hold energy back, etc. Right? Okay, so we've got the pituitary that talks to the thyroid. This is sort of our telephone messaging service, right? And it tells all of these glands to turn on and turn off. So we get a message from air traffic control that tells the thyroid now, what the thyroid does, and one of the most critical things that it does, is it regulates the rate of metabolism. Okay, the rate. So remember, we were talking in our last episode, we were talking about the candle versus the furnace. Okay, well, it is the thyroid that regulates how fast or how slow you're going to burn. So the rate of metabolism, how fast, how slow it's going to burn. Very many of you who are having issues with weight problems, fatigue, elevated cholesterol, etc., there may be a thyroid problem. And that we'll go into in another lecture. We'll talk about, how to look at that in blood work and where your doctor may be missing in that link of looking at important blood levels, not just the TSH. Okay, so the next gland would be, of course, our adrenals. Now, most people don't realize what the adrenals are or where they lie. They lie back. You've heard of the word renal. You've heard of people who have had renal failure. Renal is kidney, right? So adrenals or adrenals sit right on top of the kidneys. They add to the renals, to the kidneys. So you have two of them back here, and they're very tiny. They're about the size of your thumbnail, but they are incredibly important. As far as that, these glands basically secrete, you've heard of cortisol. This is a stressor hormone. You've heard of epinephrine or norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, another word from them is adrenaline and noradrenaline. So these are in response to our environment. So when we're in stress of any kind, and if you're not in stress, I want you to email me because I want to know what you're doing. But when you're in stress, and we're finding, and my colleague and I, Peter McCarthy, and we just finished a teleconference about stress, talking about the stress stack, and research is showing that the majority of the population is in a chronic fight or flight state. This is probably why we are seeing more obesity than we've ever seen in this country, is because of the stress levels. So it releases cortisol, which regulates our glucose, protein, and fat metabolism. So adrenals play a very, very important role. They also stimulate, remember I told you that glucose is stored in the liver and the muscle. And we only need about a teaspoon of glucose at any given time in the blood. That's about how much we have in the blood at one time. So as we use it up, as we convert it to ATP and it's used as energy, the body slowly converts glycogen back into glucose so that we can continue and maintain that tight regulation of that 1 teaspoon in the blood at all times. So liver basically stores, right? So our liver converts glucose to glycogen and glycogen back to glucose. And it does that by the message, the phone message coming from cortisol, coming from the adrenals. And then the last and very important gland that is involved is the pancreas. Now, some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the pancreas. The pancreas has many functions, but one of its most important functions, of course, is insulin release, secretion of insulin, and another hormone that you may not have heard of, and that is glucagon. Now, insulin is one hormone. Glucagon is the opposite, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But glucagon is an important hormone that most of us, in the information that we've been getting about glucose and glucagon or blood sugar, are not really aware of glucagon. But glucagon is it's the reverse. It's the turning on and turning off mechanism of the pancreas. So the pancreas produces insulin. Now, what is insulin? Well, remember we've got our teaspoon of glucose, and we've got to convert it into ATP. Well, this is done in the cell, right? You may have heard from high school biology that word mitochondria. Okay, here it comes back to haunt you again. If you're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, mitochondria is the power plant of the cell. Okay, it's in each and every one of our cells, and basically it's the power plant. It's the furnace in our cell that converts that glucose into energy or into ATP. So here's how insulin works. We have all this glucose and it circulates into the bloodstream. And the way that it gets into the cell is on the cell itself, there's like a little door, right? And that door has a little lock on it. And it opens when it recognizes the right key. So pancreas makes insulin, which is the key that lets glucose into the cell so that it can be converted into ATP or into energy. You got that so far? So you got a cell, you got a door, you got a lock, and that lock, by the way, we call a receptor site. And that receptor site takes the key, unlocks the door, and lets glucose into the cell where it can be converted into energy, right? So obviously, insulin is very important as that regulatory kind of hormone that keeps us really in balance. Now, the interesting thing about insulin is it's a fat-storing hormone. Fat-storing hormone. Keep that in mind because we're going to get into the problems with insulin in a few minutes. But let's go back to our door and our key. Now, remember I told you that the that the blood sugar, we only have about a teaspoon of blood sugar. So if you eat a candy bar, for example, obviously you're getting a lot more glucose, and you'll look at the label, you'll see glucose, dextrose, etc., like I talked about before. When you're taking that into the bloodstream and it's so refined, it's already in its glucose form or in that monosaccharide form, you might as well be injecting it right into the blood, right? So you're not injecting a teaspoon, but you're injecting a lot more. Now, the problem with these refined sugars or these broken down monosaccharides, when they enter into the blood, you put an onslaught of glucose into the blood. And the boys upstairs, air traffic control, goes, whoa, wait a minute, whoa, we've got way too much glucose going on here. So, get a message to the pancreas, tell them to start producing keys, right? So, phone message, a hormonal message, goes to the pancreas and says, we've got a lot of blood sugar. We've got to get it out of the blood. We've got to either send it get it stored, or we need to get it into the cell. So start producing keys. Okay. What happens through time if we keep putting an onslaught of so much glucose into the blood? Obviously more than a teaspoon. Well, the pancreas, the key factory, says, well, to air traffic control, well, we are producing keys, right? Well, it says, well, keep making more, all right? So what happens is we start to get a lot of keys going on, a lot of release of insulin. Now, realize, and the textbooks have stated, and research has shown, that when you eat a simple carbohydrate, right? You inject it into the blood, an onslaught of glucose goes into the blood, and all of a sudden it takes quite some time for it to process and either be stored as fat or get out of the blood and converted into energy. So insulin stays prevalent in the blood for perhaps 1, 2, 3 hours over the time that you've eaten that carbohydrate. Now, in my research when I was in grad school, actually my thesis was called Refined Carbohydrates and the Detriment to Human Health and Physiology. So one of the things that we discovered, and this was kind of interesting, and I'm going to talk about this in another adventure dealing with the glycemic index. But one of the things that we discovered, the glycemic index is an index, they started taking foods and they started just giving them to double-blind test studies or groups of people, and they started monitoring the blood and seeing how long that insulin stays in the blood. And they were noticing various different foods had various different rates by which they stimulated and continue to stimulate insulin. Guess which food out of this research was one of the not only the highest on the glycemic index, but the longest. You'll never guess. Guess again. No. Pizza. Pizza. We really don't know why. It could be that the white flour is, now I want to preface this. If it's popped, puffed, flaked, floured, shredded, or instant, it's refined. In other words, that long chain complex carbohydrate that we were talking about, that string of pearls in the factory, has been reduced down to simpler sugars. Okay, so that's just a note. We found that in pizza, interestingly enough, it was not only high on the glycemic index, but it actually continued to secrete insulin for over 9 hours. 9 hours. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, here's the problem. Okay, remember we were talking about our teams of energy? All right, so we have our first team. That is instant glucose that is playing a role in producing our energy to build our house. But then we had the guys out drinking coffee on the curb, our stored energy. All right, that would be fat. That's when our glucose is converted, and it's already been converted enough and stored as glycogen, so the rest of it gets stored as fat. Now, fat, when you have fat on the body, this is basically the body doing exactly what it should be doing. It really doesn't know anything else. It's just basically going, well, our glycogen stores are loaded. we've got plenty of glucose going on, so let's convert this to fat until we need it later. Now remember, it is insulin that is a fat-storing hormone. Wouldn't it be nice to start burning fat for fuel instead of constantly having the demand for sugars, right? So let's take a look at this. The demand for sugar causes what? Cravings. Anybody out there experience cravings for carbohydrates? This is because you're actually producing too much insulin, and I'll go into that in a second. But insulin, really you need an equal amount of insulin to an equal amount of glucose. So think of it as a teeter-totter, all right? And it's an equal balance of the keys and the glucose. Now, when we get out of balance, when we have too much sugar and too little insulin, this is called what? It's called diabetes, or hyperglycemia. Diabetes. This would be diabetes 2 in this case we're talking about. Now, when you have too little sugar and too much insulin, this is hypoglycemia or hyperinsulinemia. Okay, too much insulin, too much sugar. So you say, well, RADHlA, I don't get it. I eat plenty of sugar. How could I have so little sugar? How could I have hypoglycemia? Well, really easy. Remember, insulin pulls glucose out of the blood. So it causes a hypoglycemic reaction. That's insulin's job. Take it out of the blood. So if you are stimulating and overstimulating so much insulin, remember, we get into that simple carbohydrate, we inject it right into the blood, we have a huge onslaught of insulin production. The boys in the pancreas are going, okay, we're going to make the keys, we're going to make the keys. And if it's pizza, we're still making the keys 9 hours later. So you've got hyperinsulin hypoglycemia. Now, anyone who may experience, and here's how you know whether you've got hypoglycemia or not, you may find, have you ever noticed that when you maybe eat a meal, eat breakfast or lunch or dinner, half an hour later you've got to take a siesta? Okay, you've got hypoglycemia, chances are. Have you ever noticed that when you skip a meal, I don't need lunch, and you work through lunch, and then round about the afternoon at 3 or 4, all of a sudden it kicks in and you're going to faint. I mean, you're going to start tearing, the office apart if you don't get something to eat. Have you ever experienced that? You start to get angry. And this is because air traffic control has gotten the message, whoa, we don't have any more. We've got too much insulin, not enough glucose. Send the alarms off. We've got an emergency situation here. We don't have any energy. Bing, 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 bing. Send a message to the host, you, eat. And I don't have time to make a nice bowl of kale and a piece of fish, okay? Tear that bag of cookies open and eat it now, or give me caffeine, or give me a soda pop. And this is a typical sign of hypoglycemia. Now, what happens with hypoglycemia is these are the real first stages of eventual hyperglycemia. Why? Because the pancreas only has a bank of insulin. It can only secrete a certain amount of insulin in your lifetime. Now, if you eat this way for a long period of time, for most of your life, you're injecting these very simple saccharides into the blood sugar, you're stimulating air traffic control to tell pancreas, produce insulin, produce insulin, produce insulin. You're eating pizza and it's producing 9 hours worth of insulin, and you keep doing this through a lifetime, guess what happens? Well, the pancreas, they get burned out. It can no longer secrete insulin. So you go from a hypoglycemia to a hyperglycemia, where you no longer, you have too much insulin, too much glucose in the blood, but not enough insulin because you can't produce insulin anymore. This is how, starting out, and this is what we're seeing as a veritable epidemic in our schools, an epidemic with our children who are consuming these simple sugars at a rate of just unbelievable. Back in the 70s, we were consuming approximately 50 pounds of sugar. We're now consuming, or simple sugars, we're now consuming over 150 pounds per person. Now, I don't eat that much sugar, so that means somebody else is eating more because this is per capita. So this is why we're seeing young children now getting type 2, or what we used to call adult onset diabetes. And really, it's due to a hyperinsulinemic response. Are you with me so far? Okay. So when we have a hyperinsulinemic response through the years, we simply start to wear out the pancreas. We can no longer produce insulin. Then when we take in any kind of sugar at all, we don't have the insulin to make it work. Okay, so what we found is that diabetes 2, cardiovascular disease, obesity, especially around the middle, this is a sign that of various things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypoglycemic, the weight around the middle. If you find that you have you store most of your fat around here, this is generally an insulin-related obesity. And this is the most dangerous kind. And what's the problem with all of this insulin? Remember, it's a fat-storing hormone. It can cause the regulatory. We've got pituitary, thyroid, adrenals. Everything gets all pretty much whacked out. And what happens is we lay susceptible to these diseases, not anymore when we're 60, 70, 80 years old, but we are now seeing these diseases becoming prevalent in children, 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. And this is because of the amount of sugar we're consuming. So it's really important to understand. Now I'm going to get into insulin and glucagon, and we'll talk about the various different kinds of sugar when we get back.
If you liked this video, we have hundreds of more alternative videos ranging from sexual health to psychology to mind control. So if you liked it, go ahead and click on me to enter the Psychetruth channel.